What's the link? What's the link? Oh, it's getting hot chat.
Can you pause it? How do you
You
pause
can't pause it. It's just on.
What?
Yeah, there we go. Just the
I'm like, oh,
Assalamualaikum, everybody. Assalamualaikum, everybody. We're going to just have a little bit of chant. We're going to make a start, please.
I'm working on it still.
Ladies, say something.
and she's like, oh. And then she went, oh, well, after 3 days, I went I think we know. I've listened to you before, we know.
Guys, everyone,
Welcome.
friends, hello. Is this going through the speaker?
Yes. Friends, Romans, countrymen.
No.
Friends, Romans, countrymen.
This is tactical.
We'll just move the.
No. This is all live, man.
It is live.
It's single. Okay, we can edit this out. Right. So thank you all for coming today. I know it's a Sunday morning. So we're here to see Chris. I know some of you came in May and it was a really good day, and we're lucky that he's taken the time out to be with us again. So thank you. So the order of the day, we'll start now with about half an hour talk from Chris, and the topic is God relevant today? We'll then break into groups, and we'll have a chat amongst ourselves, and then feedback and any questions specific to this we can answer. We'll break for namaz and lunch, and then we'll have the second session, which is Do Rituals Make One a Better Muslim? Again, Chris will give a half an hour talk, and then we'll break into groups. If you've if you've got phones, please put them on silent. We will have an opportunity for question and answers at the end after Maghrib. So if you've got any questions, if you put them on the car park over there, and if they're relevant to Chris's talk, then at the end of the session, so just before lunch, we'll have an opportunity to ask a few. Tea and coffee is there. I'll give a quick background to Chris, which you've got off his website. Thank you. So Dr. Chris Hewer comes from a background in Christian theology, education, Islamic studies, and interfaith studies, and has worked in the field of Muslims in Britain and Christian-Muslim relations since 1986. More information on his work can be found at his website, which is www.chrishewer.org. So have I covered everything? And thanks to everybody who helped today. So like the guys organised me, puzzled by Imran and Humabin. And thanks to everybody who helped this morning as well. Moy's uncle will kindly do tilawat for us. Thanks.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمنت بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Chris, over to you. Don't be shy, guys. There's some like front row seats. You won't get heckled by Chris. I don't think. You
Might
do.
kicked.
You might do.
I think we're managing without the microphone, so that's good news. But I have to appear before it. Hello, distance people. I look better in reality, so they can only see my feet. It's okay. Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along, giving up a Sunday, and I hope that we'll somehow make it worthwhile. Is God relevant today? Focusing especially on morality, spirituality, connecting with God, with the word especially today in bold. That's the brief I've been given. So you can see that it's going to keep us well occupied. What I want to try and do in this half an hour is to explore some ideas that we can then talk about in groups, and then we can come back and we can reflect on them together later in the morning. So please to note from the very beginning, no imama, no beard. What this means is I am here to help us explore some ideas, not to be handing out fatwas 3 a penny, because I can't even spell fatwa, I have to tell you. The first thing I want to suggest we look at is this. Most of us learn our understanding of God as when we're very small children. You learn from your grandmother. Grandmother says, you know, God is like this, God is like that. So we build up images of God when we're very small. And often these images are the things that stay with us most, and they stay with us into our adult life and right to the very end of our adult life. Because what we learn from grandmothers enters deeper into our soul than what we learn from Maulana. We ought to be honest. Unfortunately, the problem is that's not the way that our children, born and being educated in this country, actually operate. Because the way that they operate is that they are told from the beginning, put everything to the question. Put it in your own words. Express that the way that you understand it. Do you agree? Take a different position. Now, if your whole education is based around you learn by questioning, if you don't have some depth to that question, to your own understanding, you very quickly find that it becomes very shallow. And what I want to suggest to us is that quite often these images that we learn when we're very small, that we carry on into adult life, if we don't examine them and look at them, we suddenly find that there's not a great foundation underneath them. For example, many people have an understanding of God as though God were some kind of, you know, watchman in the sky who's looking down over us and who's ultimately going to be in a judging position. God is watching, God knows, God's got the recording angels, God's going to have you on the day of judgment. Well, that's one way of looking at it. And that, of course, then affects your whole relationship with God. Now, there's another way of looking at it. And the way of looking at it I want to suggest is actually, if you understand some of the names by which God is known, they give us a completely different understanding. For example, we have 3 of the beautiful names of God, which are addressing the question of forgiving. God is Al-Ghafir. God is forgiving. God is Al-Ghafur. God is oft forgiving. And God is Al-Ghaffar. God is the most forgiving. Why do you have three names? Because none of us wants to believe that God is actually going to forgive you. Huh? Because we all want to beat ourselves up inside saying, you know, I've done something so rotten that God is never going to rubbish. Because if you are the most forgiving, then it means that your very nature is to forgive. The only thing that can stop me forgiving you is you. Because the very nature of God is to forgive. Now, at the same time, lots of the names that we have of God are in this superlative form. That means you get nothing bigger than. Okay? So God is not just generous, but Al-Karim is the most generous. So there is nothing stingy about God. There's nothing measured out about God. In the same way, a lot of the words that we have to refer to God in Arabic actually are coming from roots that give us a whole series of depth of meaning. So we want to say God is Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim. So Al-Rahman will say, oh yes, God is by nature merciful. Now, when we were children, we learned what mercy was about. It means when they're about to punch your head in, you ask them not to hit you anymore. Yes, that's what we think mercy is. Cry mercy and then we'll stop hitting you. That is nothing to do with the mercy of God. Because if you want to understand the mercy of God, and you go back to this root, Rahman, Rahim, Rahm, we know that Rahm is the same root from which we get the womb of the woman. Now, if you think then about the relationship between the human being and God as being like the relationship between the child developing within the womb and its mother. Now, does the child have to petition, please mother, nourish me today? Does the child petition, please mother, give me guidance today? Nonsense. It is of the very nature of the womb to supply that nourishment, that guidance, that everything else. Therefore, when we speak of God as Al-Rahman, we are saying it is of the very nature of God to be merciful. It doesn't say God is Al-Rahman if God is feeling like it today. Very often, we human beings like actually to put limits on God. God could never forgive that. Yeah, that is so rotten. God could never forgive it. Absolute nonsense. Who are you to decide? Because you cannot possibly be as merciful as God. So do we not have the saying that we often use that God has 100 mercies and God sends one mercy to the earth to suffice all human beings throughout all ages? Recognized? Yeah? What? Wonderful. What that means is if you could possibly imagine all the mercy throughout all ages, throughout all creatures, if you could possibly manage that, you've now got 1% of the mercy of God. You've still 99% that's beyond your ability to understand. So anything that is limiting the mercy of God is human constraint, human constriction, human limit placed on God. We know that in the Quran we have a very few major offenses that actually carry a stipulated penalty. We call these the hudud, you know. Okay. And I don't want to go into hudud. I want to cut to the important bit. because we have a hadith of the Prophet that says you are to go to any length to keep far away from the hudud. Go to any length to keep far away from the hudud. What does that mean? It means you are to use all your human ingenuity to say there must have been some extenuating circumstances. There must be some reason why we cannot impose that ultimate penalty here. Now, even we puny human beings, you know, Oscar Wilde has this lovely saying, which I like. He says, "Evil indeed is the man who is not mourned by at least one good woman." Yeah? Mothers can always find some reason why, you know, he's not really a little blighter after all, you know? Yeah? I mean, you see that, you know, the mass murderer, whatever they've done, you know, there's a wife or a sister or a mother somewhere who's crying when the guy is in prison, when the guy is executed, whatever it might be. Now, if human beings are capable of finding some reason, some goodness in that person, what makes us think that God isn't capable of finding some goodness in that person? Go to any length to keep far away from the hudud. There must be some reason why you can say that these were the extenuating circumstances. So, one of the things I want to suggest that we do in our group discussion time, and Akil is going to organize all this, so be prepared. One of the things we're going to do is I would like you to think, what images do we have of God? What images did we have of God, as it were, from grandma's knee upwards? What images do we have of God today? And then also to ask alongside that, how do those images limit God? What limits do they put on God? Because it's human beings who put the limits on God. It's not God. You know, we all know the sayings, you know, the Hadith Qudsi, which tell us, you know, I have taken upon myself the law of mercy. My mercy will overcome my wrath. Why can't you believe God? You know, if you come to me with sins as high as a mountain, but with forgiveness, with repentance in your heart, seeking forgiveness, you will find it. So again and again and again, it's us human beings who are putting limits on the all-embracing mercy of God. One of the most understood phrases, because we normally hear it being cried by somebody just before they're about to do some atrocious act. One of the most misunderstood phrases is Allahu Akbar. Because often we translate it as though it was, remember Muhammad Ali, the boxer? I'm the greatest, yeah? So Allahu Akbar means God is the greatest. Nonsense. It's not what it means at all. You know, Muhammad Ali was only the greatest if somebody else knocked him down. It's not a superlative. It is a comparative. And what that means is God is greater than, just don't try standing it up yet, sir, because one leg off my wagon. What it means is God is greater than ... God is greater than anything that you can imagine. God is greater than anything that you can say. Not just us ordinary, puny little human beings, but the greybeards too. God is greater than all your most wonderful theologies, all the depth of your spiritual teaching. God is greater than. So what it means is, no matter how much you think you understand God, God is greater than. because all our understanding of God is human limited. And our human limits are only, as big as our own little brains, as it were. But God is greater than anything that we can think of. You can never get to the full limit of God. That's why one of the images that we have of the life hereafter is a life of infinite progression. You are infinitely growing in deeper purity and wisdom, growing deeper in love of God, who is infinite. Now, mathematicians, please, infinity minus 1 equals infinity. In other words, the very definition of infinity is you never get there. There is always something more to explore. No matter how much you think you understand about God, there's always something more. Not just in this life, but in the life hereafter. That means that every time we think that we've got a corner on God, you've just blown the foundation out from underneath it, because you've said Allahu Akbar. God is greater than whatever you think. Now, this becomes really important when we're thinking about the contemporary world in which we live, contemporary lifestyle, and so on. Because we are not living either in 7th century Arabia, nor are we living in the 13th century, but we are living today in a completely new situation in which we are seeking to apply that ongoing tradition of wisdom into this new world in which we live. Now, that is our problem of morality. That we've got to be exploring, and we've also got to be saying, how are we going to test it? How do you test whether or not this is an appropriate action, whether this is an appropriate way of doing things? I am always very much struck by the saying of Imam Ali, which says, some people worship God out of the fear of hell. That is the worship of slaves. Okay, most of us would try not to be slaves. Okay. Some people worship God out of the hope of reward of heaven. That is the worship of Bora. I mean merchants. Yeah?
Nice one.
Okay. Okay. That is the worship of merchants. But how often actually is that the mentality that we bring to our worship? Dear God, I did this, you owe me. Yeah? That's really what we're saying. Yeah? Dear God, I'm stacking up some good uns here. Please take note. So it's like being a merchant. And then Imam Ali goes on and says, and some people worship God out of pure love for God alone. And that is the worship of the servants of God. Therefore, the motivation then for all human actions is the love of God alone. Not the hope of reward of heaven, and not the fear of punishment in hell, but the love of God alone. Now, another question then that I want to suggest that we explore, because this question of how do you decide what to do in practical terms in your life, in your moral life today, is a crucial question. And so I want to suggest that we explore that aphorism, that saying of Imam Ali, and therefore can we take a principle that we should be guided by doing the most loving thing in whatever situation we find ourselves in. Doing the most loving thing in whatever situation we find ourselves in. In other words, to have that as a guiding principle. Now, love can be somewhat blind at times, I mean, just because I've got beautiful eyeshadow, it doesn't mean that I'm the best man in the world. So it's not the only principle. But we need some principles that we can apply here, because we have new challenges to be faced, unpacking all the time. So doing the most loving thing, can that then be seen as an ethical guiding principle that helps us to come to some arrangement, some understanding? A particular reformist Bora problem, allow me now to address. And the problem is this, that by the very nature of the existence of the community, one is severed from some of the traditional sources of teaching within mainstream community. That's the very nature of who and what we are. Now, that is a reality. Now, there's a very good reason for that reality. It's based on the underlying ethical principle of justice. If there is no justice, there is no ethical life. If you cannot act with justice, then you are not acting in a godly way. But there are consequences to that. And the consequences are, there aren't too many people around that you can ask who are of a depth of scholarly knowledge and understanding. After all, that's why you've got an idiot like me instead of a greybeard, huh? So what are we going to do? Because this is a problem not just for today. This is a problem for tomorrow and for 10 years' time, because as the community continues and goes on through the new generations of the young ones that we see in arms around us, how are they going to find a way? How are they going to live out their lives? And it seems to me that it is crucially important that we develop some tools, some ways to actually work with these issues. Now, it's a problem for all Shia communities, because by definition, unless you happen to be a follower of the Aga Khan, okay, leave them to one side. But by definition, all other Shia communities are working in the time of the inaccessibility of the Imam of the present age. Yeah, you cannot go and ask. That means you cannot access infallible guidance. Can't be done. That's the challenge. Now then, the challenge, it seems to me, in that situation is that we have to develop tools for applying that guidance in contemporary living, in contemporary life, knowing that we cannot access infallibility. Now, the opposite of infallibility, if you don't have infallibility, what have you got? Fallibility. Fallibility means we're not going to get it right all the time, kids. Yeah? That's the reality of life. It means we did this with good faith, in good conscience, and in a passage of time, maybe we see that it's not quite the best that we could have done. But that's the nature of the world in which we're living and the situation in which we're living. Because in the absence of infallibility, all you've got is the fallible, and that's where we are. Therefore, we should not, it seems to me, in our modern contemporary world and understanding, assume that we are going to get it right all the time. Now, amongst us will tell you if you could get it right all the time, you'd be riding around in a Rolls Royce. You know, those people investing on the stock market, if they could get it right all the time, you know, nobody gets it right all the time. So if God is all merciful and all forgiving, what makes you think that getting it wrong is such a completely outrageous thing to do? That's the reality of it. So I think part of our contemporary understanding of God and morality is not beating each other up when actually we don't always get things right. Because that's the nature of being fallible. So I think that's another question that, just let me check the questions now. So if I don't talk about them, I wonder what, yeah. One of our problems is, you know, human beings were idealists, you know. It would be great if we could hit the ideals all the time. It would be great if whatever we did was the best. Now, the reality is we don't always get the best. Some of us don't get the best a lot of the time. Some of us hardly ever get the best. The question is, if you can't get the best, what about the good? What about going for the good instead of the best? And the great danger is, you could jump, it's no problem. The great danger is that you allow the optimum, the ideal, to become the enemy of the good. I can't do the ideal, therefore I won't bother about doing the good. And that leads you into all sorts of problems. So again, we have to distinguish between the optimum, the ideal, and what is good. And achieving what is good is a great deal better than nothing at all. I often encounter people who say, well, I'm not as good a Muslim as I ought to be. Well, whoopee, join the club. You know? I mean, tell us something new. The question is not, are you doing the full, you know, the full 9 yards? The question is, are you struggling to do the good? Because by struggling to do the good, you are avoiding doing the opposite. So it's all about a question of struggle. That's why jihad, struggling, is an obligatory activity. Because if you're not struggling in the cause of right and good, you're not on the path. You know, you just lie back. It's okay. Die soon. So part of our whole question then of God and contemporary morality is not allowing the optimum to become the enemy of the good. So somebody says to me, I never managed to get up for Fajr. That's great. There's not a few of us like that. Question is, do you pray in the morning when you do get up? Because the good is a great deal better than not praying at all, even though you're not hitting the optimum. Now, that's a simple example. If you've ever tried investing money, you know, what is your pension fund doing for you today? You know, God help us if we knew what our pension funds were doing for us today. But they are an extension of our moral life. Now, if you've ever tried to invest money ethically, you will know that that's almost impossible. It's almost impossible. In our completely interpenetrated society, in which, you know, the steel maker is making lovely steel that we all use, but they're also making the weapons that kill people. Right? And it doesn't matter what you are, you've got a military wing, or you've got an exploitative wing, or you're making money in some way which falls short of your morality. So it's not a question of Can you purify your money by making sure that it's always invested ethically? It is a question of struggling to live an ethical life boosts your sense of taqwa, boosts your sense of remembering constantly that you stand in the presence of God. So the struggle and the partial achievement are all good. The optimum, if it ever comes about, well, it could mean that you're in paradise, guys. So, stand ready. One of the things that we want to do is to project onto God a notion of being a judge. And we think that's a bit like being a judge in court. And the evidence is brought in, and we say, oh, on the day of judgment, the books will be opened and all will be known. And God will have out the old felt tip and be checking off and marking things up. I don't think it's like that. Does your sin hurt God? Not possible. Not possible. God is way above being hurt by our sin. So why not sin then? Because your sin hurt you. Sin is something that damages us and our relationship, not just with God, but with the rest of society, with the rest of the creation, with me, myself. It screws me up. So morality is not something that we do because it will make God feel happy. God doesn't need my moral life to feel happy. God by nature feels happy. Morality is something that I do that actually makes me more human. That actually elevates me, draws me on that spiritual path, draws me closer to God. So it's all about me and us rather than God getting a real het on because I've done something wrong. So if we're not acting morally then, in order to please God and make God feel like it's a good day, what are we doing? Well, we need then to be looking at the way in which our moral life actually helps us to develop as human beings, to live a more fully human life in a more fully human society within a balanced creation. In other words, morality is for our sake, not for something that, God is going to tot up on the day of judgment. So rather than meeting the totting up God on the day of judgment, what I think we're going to encounter instead is something really rather more awesome. Because if you've ever seriously screwed up in your life and seriously damaged a relationship, seriously let somebody down, and then you've had to go and face that person and face the consequence of your action, and you feel, crikey, what an awful mess I've made. Now imagine what it must be like then when you encounter pure goodness in God. So on the day of judgment, we encounter pure goodness. And then we see that in the reflection of pure goodness, we are somewhat screwed up, more or less. And the realization then of how screwed up we are, that's judgment. That's when we come face to face with exactly how far short we fall of the high ideals that God has set for us, the guidance that has been given. So rather than think it's all about a tally sheet and God counting up the dots and dashes at the end of the game. It's much more like, I think, one of those experiences that you have when you go out of a darkened room on a bright sunny day and it's, the bright sunlight just gets to me. So it's the bright sunlight that gets to me, the bright sunlight of absolute goodness that I will need to encounter as a purification on the day of judgment. So it changes, you see, our whole perception of morality. It's not a question of stacking something up, as it were, on the divine tally sheet. It's a question of how much do I twist up and screw up and turn into a prune my goodness, my natural goodness. How much have I distorted it? So on our moral life, then, if you like, is, as it were, trying to restore the prune to its full plum-like state. Isn't that good? Prunes to plums. Okay, we're going to draw this to an end soon. Now, but we've one more thing to do first, otherwise you can't answer the questions. And that is, we haven't really addressed yet this question of contemporary spirituality. Because again, I think this is really quite important. One of the most profoundly important things about the whole message of Islam is this is not a system of personal piety, personal spirituality, get up in the corner and do your prayers. It is not about that. It is about bringing that spiritual knowledge, that spiritual understanding of standing constantly in the presence of God into our everyday lives. So Islam is about a spiritual way of life, not a set of spiritual practices that you perform here and there. We'll look at some of those this afternoon. That's another question. So my question then is, again, what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to shift our model somewhat, shift our paradigm. And we want to shift it in this way. Just as all our actions are based on our intentions, so we're looking at the niyyah behind all our actions, doing the most loving thing, the niyyah behind the action, and the influence of that then in our moral life. Also then, it seems to me that we have to look at that in our spiritual life. What is the difference between doing the washing up in a spiritual way and in a non-spiritual way? It's all about the niyyah. It's about the intention that you form in the process. Because it is that intention which, as it were, includes God in the act. It includes the connectivity between me and God. So it is the intention then. It is, what's the difference between getting up to the baby when it cries in the night because you can't sleep anymore, and getting up to the baby when it cries in the night because you know it needs you? It's about the intention behind the act. What is the difference between earning a living because you need the money and earning a living because you need to make the world a better place, which also will provide the money that you need to keep your family? So what we need to do then, if we're looking at our spiritual life now, our connectivity with God, is to be looking at this intention, bringing the spirituality out of every act. I love the Hindu saying, I don't know if you've ever heard, must have heard some Hindu people will talk about, what is food? Food is the edible love of God. food is the edible love of God. You can actually touch it. You can put it inside you. Now that's about a spirituality. That's about your understanding of your relationship with the plants and the rest of the animals, the rest of the creation. Food is the edible love of God. It's a way of bringing that love into me. So another question then that I'd like us to focus on is the spirituality of everyday acts. How do we change our everyday activities, as it were, to bring out that underlying niyyah of saying this is a way of establishing a deeper connection with God? And if you want to know what that connection with God looks like, well, now, we're told that the journey is into the heart of the individual, and in the heart of the individual, that is where we find the encounter with God. So the encounter with God is within our own hearts. Yeah. God is by definition without time, without space. There is nowhere that God is. There is nowhere that God is not. Therefore, God is within as well as without. There is nowhere that God is not. Therefore, we weigh things. How do you decide on a contemporary, godly, spiritual, moral life? You weigh it in your own heart. You weigh it in your heart. Can I live with this before God and hopefully before also a godly community? That's not a community that's going to be judging you and screwing up and saying you're a rotten sinner because you did what I didn't do. But that's a godly community that is actually sharing in that process together. Because I think that's what's going to be necessary if this community continues to exist. It's got to find that inner strength within itself to guide further generations in this society. So I'm sure that Akil is at this very moment biting his way through a pencil saying he can't tell the time, that man. So I'm going to shut up. Akil is going to tell us about groups. And while he's doing that, I'm going to write up on the flip chart some of the, I'm going to write all of the questions nice and neatly that I tried to just touch on. And then I suggest that we talk about those things in the groups that Akil is going to talk about, and then we'll come back and see where we go from there. He's counting now, so at the moment he's going down to his toes. When he gets the socks up.
So I'm just gonna. Oh, thanks, Chris. That was that was really good. I mean,
What was the niyyah behind